FSR 3.1 plus frame generation arrived to all the Nixie sports, so we got Spider-Man Remastered, Miles Morales, Horizon Forbidden West, Ghost of Tsushima, and Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. So I'm going to show you this with the camera pointing at the screen so you can see HDR on or off and 90 Hz. So we can actually test it properly because with my capture card we cannot get there, so let's get started right away. So for Spider-Man Remastered, 1280 by 800, HDR off, because if it's on for some reason we lose lots of color saturation. So I don't know, it looks bad with HDR on for some reason. I think it looks a lot better. Maybe in the camera you cannot notice that. FSR 3 quality, and the graphics are basically this. So these are the settings, let's get into it. It's actually a pretty good frame rate with quality FSR 3. It doesn't look particularly great with FSR 3 in comparison to FSR 2, at least in my opinion, but the base frame rate is actually better than I expected. I've been playing this a lot on the LCD Steam Deck. This is my first video on the OLED Steam Deck. So yeah, it's pretty good. But visually, at least on this one, XeSS, in my opinion, looks a lot better. So we apply the changes, and that gives us, when we're not moving, 62 FPS. And if we enable frame gen, that is the new option, we get something weird. As you can notice, the GPU clock is super low and the frame times are all over the place. Well, let's fix it. To fix it, I've been banging my head against the wall on this one. Make sure the GPU clock is at least 1200 MHz. In this case, we can push it to 1400. So either 1300 instead. And as you can see now, I mean, we take juice out of the CPU to be able to do this. But now it's actually hitting 70 FPS. So frame gen is actually working. It has some ghosting here and there. I'm going to zoom in to show you, especially when Spider-Man is running towards the wall. But again, it's a very minor thing, especially in comparison to the LCD Steam Deck that I tested a couple days ago. Because here the base frame rate is higher and the screen is 90 Hz. So we are into the 60 to 70 FPS range, allowed tearing is on, frame limit, we could limit it to something lower than 90 maybe, but I think this is good enough, and with this we get like 2 hours of battery, give or take, but I feel the latency in the controls still, which also happened on the ROG Ally, and it had a higher base frame rate. So if we want the game to be smoother looking, with smoother looking doesn't mean that it feels exactly like that. So the game doesn't feel like it's playing at 60, but it looks like it's playing above 60. It's hard to explain, I know, but it's basically generating those fake frames. So one in between each frame is generating a fake frame, so latency is impossible to avoid. I mean, it's physically impossible, I would say. But in this case, since the base frame rate is above 40 most of the time, the frame rate is not so bad. So in this case, I think it's pretty impressive. So let's disable frame gen, let's see the real frame rate. Also, let's remove the manual GPU clock again. And the base frame rate, as you can see, is into the 50s without any frame generation. So in this case, I'll probably lock it to 45 and call it a day. So just open this menu. Let me do that again. 45, which is half 90 Hz. And there we go. Now we're locked at 45. It actually looks pretty good, in my opinion. Feels very responsive, more responsive than frame generation, in my opinion. And you get more battery life, which is also important. But I think 45 in this game on the smaller screen feels perfectly fine. So yeah. In my opinion, this is more of a 50 or 45 FPS game. Feels great and looks amazing on the OLED screen. And if you want frame gen, you can do it, but I think it's not 100% necessary due to the extra input latency. But the game looks pretty damn smooth. Looks when you're using frame gen. And use XeSS instead of FSR 3 because FSR 3 in this game still looks pretty chunky, very similar to FSR 2. XeSS is pretty good though, so I highly recommend this other setting without frame gen. For Spider-Man Miles Morales, 800p, HDR, again I disabled it because it looks that it lacks color when HDR is on. Not sure if you can notice that on the camera. FSR 3 quality to get started, no frame gen. These are the settings. Basically a mix between medium and low, similar to the previous game. So let me show you how it is without frame gen. So first things first, FSR 3, I think it doesn't look particularly great on this one. When it comes to the frame rate, it runs worse than Spider-Man Remastered. By a small amount, but definitely noticeable. So my advice is to go to display, XeSS on quality, a few extra frames, very small improvement there, and image quality, and frame generation makes us go from 67 all the way up to 90. Which again, does this mean that the game feels like playing at 90 FPS? No. You get extra latency, as I said in the previous one. Still, I think it's pretty impressive the numbers that it can get. I mean, the perception of your eyes when you're looking at the screen, it feels above 60, but when you're actually controlling the game, there's some extra input lag, which you're not going to notice for me playing. You have to try it for yourself. Personally, I don't think it's a great idea to use frame gen in this game, just because of the latency, but if you're not sensitive to that sort of thing, or you basically don't care and want it to look smooth, well, you can do it. With these settings you might not notice if you're not used to it. It actually looks pretty smooth, which is what some people care about. Some people don't mind when it comes to input latency. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, 800p. HDR is disabled because, like in the Spider-Man games, I don't know why, it just looks that the color saturation is missing. I don't know, it just doesn't look as colorful. Not sure if that's an issue with the game itself, or maybe I'm doing something wrong. Let me know in the comments, because you are usually right. So, FSR 3 quality, graphics, basically this, as you see here. So with FSR 3 quality and no frame generation, at least here, the game feels pretty good to play. Oh, there is gyro enabled when touching the stick. Whoops, I forgot to turn that off. But the game looks amazing on the OLED screen. Holy hell. I don't know how they did it. Okay, so the base frame rate is actually pretty low on this one. We're heavily GPU limited. So what I'm going to do, first of all, FSR 3 looks pretty chunky. So yeah, just like I said when I tested this game on release, use XeSS. XeSS in this game, in my opinion, looks a lot better. Maybe put it on balanced XeSS to get a few extra frames. So we now are into the 40s, and with frame generation, okay, we jump all the way up into the 70s, but again, that's that perception. Alright, so the game says 60 FPS, but when I move the stick, I can really, yeah, I can notice the input latency. So despite number bigger doesn't mean experience better every time. It does look smoother to the eyes, but as I've been saying on the previous game as well, I mean, especially on this one. I mean, on the Spider-Man games, it's not so bad. The input lag feels worse because you're actually doing a lot of aiming. So that requires more precision, and when it requires more precision, more input lag will be noticeable. It will be way more obvious. Yeah, when I move the stick, it takes a bit to respond to my command, basically. So let's turn off frame generation for a moment. Yeah, the base frame rate was already... Yeah, but it responds way faster to my movement. So this will be like a 30 FPS game for me, especially in this heavier section when it comes to the GPU. And visually, it's a spectacular game, especially on the OLED screen. But frame gen on this one, just the latency makes it horrible with frame generation, in my opinion, of course. But the perception of smoothness is there, which is pretty cool. But if you ever played, I don't know, a streamed game over the internet with a slow connection, this is what it feels like. So it looks smooth, but when you're playing it, there's input lag. For Horizon Forbidden West, we're using 800p. By default, the game is on ultra performance FSR 3 and very low preset, so we're going to stick to it. But instead of ultra performance, we're using performance FSR 3. And FSR 3 in this game doesn't look particularly great, like on the previous ones, but XeSS isn't that much better either on this one, at least in my opinion. It's a tiny bit better. But as you can see, when I'm playing without frame gen, I mean, it drops into the upper 20s. I mean, yeah, it's not great. So if we enable frame generation and we use XeSS, so we have a tiny bit better image quality from XeSS plus frame generation. Since the base frame rate is so low, in this case upper 20s, low 30s, the input I cannot hit anything. The input latency is insanely high. The frame times are horrible. I cannot hit anything. I mean, just look at me moving the stick, right stick. Yeah. I mean, I'd rather play at 25 FPS. At least there, the controls respond better than here with this input latency. It's crazy. Crazy high input latency. And as you can see, the GPU clocks drop like in the other games. But in this case, we're both CPU and GPU bound. So if we manually put the GPU clock to 1600, it looks like we're getting into the 30s. But the input latency, man, look at those edges at the bottom right corner of the screen. I'm going to move that part so you can see it. It looks bad. Just don't do it. It's not worth it. The game just has too much input lag, so I'd rather use the lowest settings with performance XeSS and no frame generation, and you have better input latency than this. This is horrible. I mean, doesn't make sense to use it. For Ghost of Tsushima, we're using 800p, balanced FSR 3. It's pretty GPU demanding, and on graphics, basically a mix between medium and low. So with those settings, let's see what frame rate we get right away. Alright, we get like, okay, 40s with drops into the upper 30s. Not the worst. Actually, better than I anticipated, honestly. Never played this on the OLED deck. Pretty cool improvement, actually. Probably has to do with the faster memory. It actually looks good on the smaller screen with balanced FSR 3, although there's still some weird pixelation when moving the camera. I'm probably going to zoom in to show you. But the game responds pretty well. So yeah, not bad. Let's get into a fight super quickly. Before doing that though, let's use XeSS instead. In this game, in my opinion, looks better than FSR. Still not perfect though. I think it still has some issues with transparencies and effects. And if we enable frame generation, which this game already had, yeah, we get closer to... It's at 60, but it doesn't feel like 60. I don't know. It's weird. So, yeah, just by moving the camera, just like I said on Horizon Forbidden West, doesn't feel amazing to play. And I cannot parry, for the love of God, I cannot parry. Cannot hit anything. Hang on. Let me put it at the lowest settings just to test it and see if we can get anything better. So lowest settings I wouldn't say is worth it in this case. Without frame gen we get, yeah, into the 50s in the pause menu. But as you can see, it's still, I don't know, it feels not consistent enough. The good thing though is that HDR is enabled by default, and if you disable it, it loses all the colors, like I said on Spider-Man, but the other way around. So yeah, the number says 60, but yeah, this doesn't feel like 60s at all. Let me try one thing that I did before, manual GPU clock. Let's put it at 1400. Yeah, this is getting bugged out. What the hell? Yeah, no, this is not good enough with that GPU clock tweak. Let's keep it at 1600. Let's see what happens. Yeah, no. This doesn't fix the issue. Frame times are better. But the game just slows down more often. So I wouldn't recommend Ghost of Tsushima with frame generation, even on low settings, because it just looks choppy. And well, the latency, just like I said on Horizon, still happens. Would I use FSR 3.1 frame generation on the Steam Deck OLED? Maybe in the Spider-Man games, that's where it felt right, because the base frame rate was above 40 basically at all times. You can feel the latency, but it's not as bad as in the other games, because you don't need to be doing any precise aiming. You have to do dodges, but you have a good window of time to do it. Then when it comes to Horizon Zero Dawn, Forbidden West, and Ghost of Tsushima and Ratchet and Clank, since you have to do pretty precise timing, and in the other games you actually have to aim guns and bows and arrows and stuff, I wouldn't recommend frame gen, because the base frame rate on those is already below 40 in some sections, which means that the frame generation is going to have even more input latency, which in my opinion completely ruins the gaming experience, because you're not getting good response from your controls in games that actually require it. So yeah, frame gen may look nice in a video, but in real life it's just too much latency. If you don't notice it, good for you. But if you play a lot of games, I think you'll notice it right away. So only for the Spider-Man games I would recommend frame gen if you want the games to look smoother, but not particularly great for controller latency, basically. But again, on the Spider-Man games I think you can get away with it, just because of the fact that you have a lot of time to dodge the attacks and all that is not, and they are not particularly difficult games, so yeah. But on the other ones, just I would avoid frame gen and use XeSS for upscaling, targeting 30 to 45 FPS, depending on the game. And on Horizon Forbidden West, good luck, basically. So, thank you so much for watching. That was my first video covering the Steam Deck OLED's performance. Is it better than the LCD Steam Deck? Yes, especially when it comes to the screen and all that. It's better when it comes to frame rate by a very small margin, but it feels more consistent when it comes to performance. And it also has HDR, which some games like Ghost of Tsushima and Horizon Forbidden West look pretty good at. But in some others, like Spider-Man, for some reason with HDR on, the image loses all the nice colors to them. So in those cases, I would just disable HDR. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did doing it myself. Hope I see you on the next one, and thanks for watching.